episode of the Brady Bumps podcast. Today we have our special guest.
Hey, I'm Mike Broadhead. I'm the police chief in the city of Statesboro. In about year 36 of my career, spent the majority of it in the Denver area, and then was a police chief in Wyoming prior to coming to Statesboro a little over 6 years ago.
Yeah, sweet. All right, start rattling off some questions here. Anybody want to?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So, working in the Statesboro PD, do y'all have any mental health programs that support officers with any sort of mental health illnesses going on?
Yeah, so we have, we do an initial screening tool prior to hiring officers and dispatchers to sort of get a baseline on their mental health. And obviously, there are some people that are really not fit out for this profession, and so we try to screen them out during that psychological process. But for those who are working here, we now have a baseline of kind of where they're at, right? And so if we ever had a critical need to reassess them, then we could at least send them to the same psychiatrist or psychologist, and they could, kind of look back at their initial, baseline and kind of see where they're at, and if there's been any changes in their coping mechanisms or those kind of things. Interestingly, we have an officer right now who's kind of going through that. We sent him for a fitness for duty examination for mental health because he was just really struggling, and he didn't pass that fitness for duty. So we pulled him off the street, and he's been going through some counseling, and he gets veterans benefits, and so that helps him a little bit pay for some of those sessions. And then when we sent him back for a reassessment, one of the big things that the psychologist was concerned about was that his coping mechanisms were not portable, as they put it. Like for him, chilling out at home and watching a movie was a good way for him to sort of decompress. And the psychologist was really concerned because, that doesn't really help you in the moment.
Yeah.
If you're experiencing some kind of trauma, what are you going to do in that moment? And so that was just kind of eye-opening to me to sort of think about that idea that we need to help officers and dispatchers do an incredibly stressful job, figure out how to work on their mental health in the middle of or immediately following some kind of trauma or some kind of critical kind of incident. We subscribe to an EAP service where officers can, on their own, anonymously, reach out and get some mental health help. There's a real stigma in law enforcement that you don't want to be the weak one who had to call for mental health help, and so that's really set us back for generations, frankly, of officers. And I think that we're becoming much more aware of a couple of things. One is that everybody needs a little help once in a while, and so how can we make that accessible to them and anonymous so that they don't worry that it's going to impact their job, right? That we're going to think that they've lost their mind, we can't put them out there, and it really is not about that. It's really more emotional health as much as anything, right? So we're a work in progress, honestly. I think that our entire profession is a work in progress. I came on the job in 1988, and it very much was you compartmentalize your feelings and they don't belong at work. And if you're having problems, most guys turn to alcohol, frankly, and then they would have these things that were well known as choir practices, where officers would meet after their shift, drink a lot, kind of hash things out, and kind of talk about it. And honestly, I think in those days and times it worked for them, but we live in a very different time, and trying to get people professional help, it's a challenge. There's not nearly enough resources in the entire spectrum of mental health treatment. There's not enough resources, and that's certainly true within our profession. There's not enough resources.
Yeah. One topic that we really hit hard on, especially for officers this semester, was the idea of burnout. Mm-hmm. How have you seen burnout in your officers? Have you seen burnout in yourself? How did you sort of push through that? How do you handle that idea of burnout?
Yeah, I think that burnout is a real thing. I think society has changed too, and so I'm going to kind of take the long way around the barn maybe, but the that guy who used to put the same bolt on a same car on GM's assembly line for 40 years, I don't think that guy exists anymore. People are looking to be challenged more. They're not, the idea of going to work and grinding it out every day is not a very popular thought anymore, and so it's difficult to find people who are willing to do that. When people get into law enforcement, they find out very quickly that it is a grind. It is an everyday show up, handle other people's problems, and grind it out. For the right personality, that works great, but it's a very difficult sell in the world of, influencers and people living these allegedly fabulous lives on social media. And we can know we can know logically that a lot of that's a lie, right? But when you're bombarded with it every day and you're thinking, well, how come that person's on vacation in Morocco? How come that person's skiing in Vail this week? And then people start to think, wow, I get paid really terribly. I can't afford any of that stuff. Yeah. And so I think all of that's contributing to it. But I think that what, officers historically going through burnout and what today's officers look like in burnout are very different. Like back when I started in the late 80s, you'd always have a couple of guys that everybody knew were the burnouts, and they were just grumpy and cynical, and most of them smoked like chimneys and drank coffee all day, although I drink coffee all day now. But and everyone kind of knew that they were just at that point in their career, they didn't have any tolerance for people anymore, any patience for people, and without any credit to our agencies, they didn't do anything for those guys. They just kind of acknowledged that they were not good officers anymore and just kept them on the payroll, right? But today we're seeing those same kind of factors in officers who have 4 and 5 years experience, where those guys were at the 19, 20, 23 year mark. Now they're at 4, 5, 6 year mark, and so it's very different. And I think a lot of that has to do with expectations. I mean, somehow mining companies convince guys to go down into coal mines for 30 years, and they didn't get burned out, and so I don't think you can find those people anymore either much. But in law enforcement, I think what leads to burnout a lot is just dealing with people on their worst day, but every day, and call after call. And so to that person, that's a really big deal. But the officer's like, I just left a similar situation and I'm going to go to a similar situation.
Yeah.
Your situation is not that unique. But to that person, it's everything right then, right? And so I do think that to some degree, the officers start getting burned out just from that, right? I think the other thing that is difficult is that we spend way too much of our time helping people who cannot just live their life, right? They need help with everything. And they will call because, well, I'm not getting along with my brother. How old is your brother? 50. How old are you? 55. What is exactly you want us to do to help you? Well, I can never talk to him. He just won't. And, we're doing like family counseling, and I think for particularly for a young officer, that's a really weird position to be put in. We historically think of officers getting burnt out because of trauma, because they're seeing. We had a child die in a pool last week, and so an officer did CPR on that child for a little while, and the child didn't make it. And we think of those kind of traumatic events, and I do think that I'm going to go back to trauma in just a minute, but I don't think that's what's burning people out. Mm-hmm. It's not the excitement of the job that's burning people out. It's the day-to-day grind that's burning them. They're literally getting ground down, and it's from dealing with other people's emotions, honestly. One thing that we're recognizing, though, about post-traumatic stress is that it can be cumulative, right? So you have an officer who goes to a car crash, and maybe there's a child or a teenager in that car crash, and they have a teenager at home. And so that impacts them differently maybe than another officer who doesn't have a child of that age at home. So those two officers have the exact same experience, but they go away with a very different experience, right? Well, it takes time to process that sometimes. If you personalize a call you've been on, it can take you a while to process that. If you get another similar call too soon before you've processed it, then you're not really processing the first one, right? And so that cumulative effect of trauma, we're just now on the front edge of the research on that, honestly, and I think that we're going to find that a whole lot of first responders, police officers, firefighters, EMS, are suffering from some level of post-traumatic stress just because of the cumulative effect of that.
What is your general opinion on treatment for mental health and law enforcement in the community, like community members, or just the criminal justice system as a whole?
Yeah, I think that our system is broken, and it's going to take a tremendous effort to fix it. We closed, America, we closed all of our mental health institutions back in about, 1980, 82, somewhere in there, and nothing was built to replace it. And so we have people just in our little town, we have people in mental health crisis every single day that we're interacting with. We know that officers, we've just been talking about how we need to try to find ways to get better help for officers going through stuff, right? But it's really difficult when there's no beds for people who are actively in crisis. We'll take people to the hospital who are clearly suicidal or homicidal, and the hospital will release them in an hour. And I don't know if you've ever been to the ER, but you can't get out of there in an hour. It's like 5 hours just to walk in the door.
Yeah.
But mental health patients get worked right through the system because, just to be frank, there's no money in it, and there's no place for the doctors to send people. So they get very frustrated, and they just say, this person's fine, send them out the door. We had an incident within the last, I don't know, it's probably been 6 or 8 months ago. We were interacting with a guy 2 or 3 times because he wasn't suicidal or homicidal, but he was just not right. Like, he was stripping his clothes off and shouting and yelling, and it was just scaring people, but he wasn't really threatening anybody. The officers kept going out there and talking to him. They finally convinced him to go to the hospital. There wasn't anything to put him on a mental health hold. They just had to convince him, hey, let's go talk to a doctor, you need some help. And they kicked him out literally like in an hour. And then the next thing we know is he went into one of our restaurants and went in the back and attacked the cooks and just like physically attacked them. Oh. So, we had like 6 officers tied up in there wrestling with this guy in a kitchen, which is a horrible place to fight somebody because all the knives and stuff. And all basically because he's in crisis and there's no place for him. So where does he end up? He ends up where most mentally ill people end up, which is the jail, right? Yeah. Where they're going to get no services. We would all agree that jail is the absolute worst place to put people who need mental health treatment, and that's where they all end up because there is no other system. Mm-hmm. At least in jail, we can lock them in and keep them safe and keep people safe from them, right? So we kind of talk about mental health always in the crisis mode, but we have to also understand that the need is so tremendous that it is for a whole lot of people every day just a struggle. So they might not be in crisis, in emergency crisis, but they're dealing with mental health underlying issues every day. And so what we find a lot of times is that people who are getting mental health treatment don't like the medication. They don't like the way it makes them feel, and so they either quit it cold turkey, which is terrible on those kind of drugs, or they start selling it and then they start supplementing it with drugs and alcohol, other kinds of drugs that makes them feel better. So we know that mental health and substance abuse are co-occurring problems. Unfortunately, they have to be treated separately, right? They require different kinds of treatment, but you can't really get to the mental health issue until you deal with the substance abuse issue, right? And so it's complicated, and our society is doing a failing job of dealing with it.
Kind of piggybacking off of that question, what treatments, programs, or coping mechanisms help best for the law enforcement community or the community as a whole?
Yeah, a really tough question because I think it's individual. It's what for some people they need to go do something active. They need to be in the gym. They need to whatever. Some people kind of prefer something a little bit more introspective, right? I remember when I was in Wyoming as a chief, I brought in a lady who gave our officers a class on journaling to say, look, it's cathartic to put things down on paper. You don't have to show it to anybody. Just sit down and journal when you're not feeling good about stuff or when you're bothered by stuff. And all the officers kind of snickered and laughed about it. But I think there's a lot of merit to that, right? But we got to find a way to normalize it so it's not, again, like, oh, I'm weak, I have to journal, I have to write my diary that I wasn't feeling good today, right? We got to get past that and form some kind of healthy attachment to those kinds of things. I also had a circumstance one time where I think there were 6 or 7 officers and a dispatcher involved in a traumatic event, and I sent them all to see a psychologist in one time. And because of where we lived, it was like 2 hours to the psychologist. So we put them in a van, sent them up there, and they individually spent the day meeting with psychologists, and then they all came back together. And every one of them, when I talked to them afterwards, said that they got more benefit from the van ride than they did from meeting with a psychologist. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to choir practice, right? It's more about people with similar circumstances, talking about it, laughing about it a little bit if they can, trying to just put each other at ease. And that ability to talk about it is what I think has a lot of value. So what we have to do is find healthy ways to get people to have those conversations with people that they trust. This is the other issue I think for law enforcement officers is that and I think military veterans are the same. They're going to go see a psychologist who they don't trust or respect. They're going to say, you can't possibly help me because you don't know what I've been through. You have no idea what it means to do what I've done. The trauma that brought me here today is so beyond any of your life experiences, right? Whether that's fair or not doesn't matter. That's how they perceive it, right? But what they have to learn is that through those conversations, the psychologist doesn't have to have had those experiences. They don't have to even know more than the person. They just got to get the person talking about it, right? Because all of our psychological issues are self-contained issues, right? And so sometimes hearing us talk about it helps us process what we're even talking about, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And it's weird. I mean, I think the brain is something we don't really quite understand, but I think we're kind of peeling it apart piece by piece.
So sort of, we're piggybacking off a piggyback. What are coping mechanisms that you implement in your life that help you, keep in a calm headspace to, do what you do?
Yeah, I can be honest and say that, like, I've been very fortunate in my life. Like, I feel like the way I was raised and my life experiences is that I have a lot of resiliency around the mental health issue, and I don't take my job home. Like, I literally have been very fortunate in my life that very few things that I've been involved in have traumatized me. And those that have, I have good support mechanisms in my family that I can sit down with and say, man, this was messed up. I can only remember, like, I'll give you an example. I had a case that still bothers me that a young child died of probably SIDS, and he was at the coroner's office. And we used to have to attend all of our autopsies in any case we were assigned to, and which is traumatic enough if you've ever been to an autopsy. I recommend you go once, but after about 100 of them, you're kind of like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But I had never been to one of an infant, and these two nurses came to harvest his eyeballs. His name was Michael, I can still remember that, and they were going to harvest his eyes for organ donation. And I learned a ton about eyes. I learned that you're born with full-sized eyeballs, right? And they don't grow after birth. And so this kid has these great big blue eyeballs, and they're harvesting them. And I was so enamored with the science of how I was fascinated by how this was happening, and the nurses were really cool about being able to explain it all to me and what they were doing. And then the next day I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, that's not right. Like, that is not a normal experience. No one should ever see that. And so even to this day, like, and I don't have a coping mechanism for it. I just tell the story when I think about it because I still think about that sometimes, right? But I've been fortunate. I don't have nightmares. I don't have any of those kinds of issues. I have a real heart for people who do, because you can imagine, this is one of the reasons why trauma is so hurtful to people, is their brain is kind of locked onto thinking about it, and then they try to go to sleep and they can't because they wake up. So they don't want to go to sleep because they're thinking about that when they try to go to sleep. And so then they're tired. And so we add tired on top of traumatized, and then so what are they going to do? They're going to turn to substance abuse because it's going to help numb them, or it's going to help them sleep. And so it's kind of a cycle. So to answer the question for myself, I've just been really fortunate that I guess just my life and my lifestyle, I couldn't tell you, I don't have any breathing techniques. I don't have any, there's stuff I like to do, and it helps me relax. And so, yeah.
Given the negative stigma on law enforcement, how do you remain professional, and how has it or hasn't it affected your mental health?
Yeah, I had some unique experiences after 2020 when people were protesting the police, and I was providing security to help them be safe while they protested me. And they stood in front of this building, about 300 people, and chanted at me while I stood in the street behind them. And it was a really unique experience because I was like, literally never been in this position before. And so it was largely the crowd wasn't largely black, but it was basically a Black Lives Matter kind of movement, right? And so, the people that were sort of shouting at me and calling me by name, and this pastor was leading them in chants. And I had a black female officer and a black male officer who came from behind the crowd and came out and stood with me. And that was really touching to me, because they didn't have to do that. Like, I was out there taking the abuse, and it was okay. I was fine with it. But when they came out, like, it almost made me cry, because I was like, why would you put your guys in that position? Or, why would you guys put yourself in that position? And they just were out there to support me. And so I think that went a long ways towards kind of calming the crowd a little bit. They were never violent. They were never going to be aggressive. It was just a weird position to be in. So, I might be a little bit unique in this day and age. Like, I decided I was going to become a police officer in the 3rd grade, and I never wavered from that, right? And so I even joined the Army as an MP just because they'd let me be a cop at 18. I didn't have to wait till I was 21, right? And so now here I am at age 57, continuing to do that. And so to me, the profession is noble. I feel like it's been a calling in my life. Most people, I think, that we're hiring nowadays, they don't feel called in that same way. So I would say that right now is the single most difficult time in the history of American policing, with the anti-police sentiment, with, crime is starting to rise again, particularly violent crime in a lot of places, and that we just can't find people willing to be police officers in the numbers that we need to make up for our shortages, right? And then that creates more stress for the officers that are working because they don't get a break, because there's not enough people handling calls, right? And so it's a really difficult time, but all through that, I just see my mission as trying to find ways to support these young officers, because frankly, they're young. I mean, most of them are you guys' age or just a little bit older, and I know what they're experiencing, and so my job really is just to do my best to support them. And so that's what I'm passionate about. I'm just passionate about trying to help our young officers keep some perspective, understand that you don't have to take the job home with you. You're not going to fix the world. That's not even why we're here. We're not crusaders. We are here simply to provide a service to people when they need it, and then leave it at their doorstep and go do the next one. So,
yeah. So y'all, I know y'all do a lot of like community work. You teach a couple classes at the university. You said you even had an event today, and I we see y'all everywhere at any event, everywhere. Y'all are out there at least doing something to get involved in the community. How do you feel like that community engagement has helped with calming some of the stigmas to the police? With because a lot of people, when they get pulled over by the police, get very stressed out, and that causes some people to make rash decisions. How do you feel like being that open and available to people has helped with mental health and people in the community?
Well, I think that we enjoy great support from our community in this particular community. Not every town can say that, and a lot of times the reason they don't have good relationships is because the police have ruined those relationships. So the first thing we have to do is own that. We have to understand that it's not the community's job to reach out to us. It's our job to reach out to them during times of non-enforcement so that they can see that our officers are just human beings. Like we started this thing called Chess and Pizza, where we're playing chess with kids and feeding them pizza. And so we do it the fourth Wednesday of every month. So we did it last night at Holiday Pizza. And we're getting this really great group. I think we had about 25 kids maybe showed up to play chess. And they range in ages, some high school, some like elementary kids who beat me every time. It makes me irritated. But it's those kinds of things where like these kids are not growing up seeing, oh, this police officer is just a person. Like the uniform's kind of scary, but he's just a person. And we can laugh and joke, right? So then you have to hit every kind of age group, and then you have people in different kinds of interests. So how do you interact with those groups? We started a monthly pistol match last year, and so we have a whole different group of people who come out and shoot with us once a month. And again, it's just a different demographic of people. They tend to be older, they tend to be a little bit more affluent, and have a little bit more free time to go shoot and stuff. And they're great supporters of the police, but that's our effort to give back to them too, right? When there was something last Saturday, we had something at one of the churches, kind of in more of the low-income part of town, and we were there too, because I think all of those groups need to see us in non-enforcement ways. What we hope to pay off is that when we have another, summer of 2020, that we're not having our town burned down, right? And it didn't happen. Like we had rallies, we had a lot of emotion, but there was no property damage. We didn't get in fights with the police. We didn't, and that was, I have to say, that was very deliberate as well. Like you see all these towns, Philadelphia, Baltimore, LA, and what was on camera was lines of cops wearing turtle gear and upset people shouting at them. And I didn't want to give our protesters, our citizens, I didn't want to give them that photo op. I didn't want to give them a line of cops that would, to some degree, instigate them or raise their emotions up. And so, me and one female officer worked those events by ourselves. Now, I say that we were only publicly by ourselves. Like we had the officers a couple blocks away in every direction, loaded up and ready to go. We had a tear gas plan. We had guys to do emergency rescues if we had to get in the middle of a crowd and drag people out. But the public doesn't need to see all that, right? And so to me, that's another example of community policing. They think that two people could police a crowd of 300 or 400 people, and we couldn't if they got out of control. But by being prepared and having a plan, we're better able to provide that service to people, right? But we don't want to be seen. If we had showed up with all those officers, all those assets, it changes the whole tone, right? Now it starts to look like, oh, the police are here against us. Well, all we're here to do is make sure you guys can have a safe event, do your rally, even though you're protesting us, have a rally, get it out of your system, whatever. But let's be friends at the end of it, right?
Yeah. This is a question that you asked Reiner. I think you asked Reiner. But like, what are tips that you would give us as we, we're all pretty close to graduating, as we go out into the law enforcement career? What are things, mental health wise, that we should be trying to strive for to change to help law enforcement as we, we're that new generation coming into the business?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that you guys could do, regardless of what you do for a living, is to develop resilience, right? This idea that like a rubber band can be stretched and twisted and pulled out of shape, and when you let go of it, it goes back to being a rubber band. And that's what you got to be. You have to figure out, how can I just be me? I can go work, I can go do that, whatever, but at the end of the day, no matter how much I've been pulled or twisted or spent, I'm going to come back to being who I am. And you do that by having principles and values that you live by, right? So those things don't change. I'm not saying they can evolve over time. If you get different information, you might want to change, but a core value shouldn't change, right? And you just have to have an honest conversation with yourself about, who am I really? So yeah, I can put on my uniform and I can go out and do this job, or I can be a probation officer or a teacher or whatever I'm going to do, but at the end of the day, I'm going to come back to being me, right? And so I think resiliency is built upon having good core values and knowing who you are, right? I think having healthy outlets that don't involve drugs and alcohol is a huge thing. That's an easy cop out. I'll just have a few drinks. I'll just have some wine. But that's just a road that you get on, and it just leads to destruction, right? I think having healthy relationships outside of your profession is important, particularly in law enforcement. One of the things that we do in law enforcement sometimes is we think, well, I can only talk to people with a shared experience. So the four of us can go have choir practice. Well, pretty soon I start alienating my friends and family that I had from before that, and you can't do it. It needs to be the other way. Keep your work friends at work and go have some other friends, right? People that can help you with perspective. I remember telling a story one time to a guy, and I won't bore you with the details, but it was a pretty violent crime that I responded to, and it was pretty high speed. Like it was in the process of happening. It was a murder-suicide, happened right in front of us, and I'm telling this story and to other cops, and they're all like interested. Oh yeah, what'd you do then? And it was a normal kind of conversation. Well, I told the same story to a friend of mine who was not in law enforcement, and he was horrified. Like, he looked at me like, what is wrong with you? And I really gave me some perspective that I was like, yeah, I can see how this is not for public consumption, right? Like, this is a different experience. So I don't need to bring my friends into that, right? But I can go to my friends. I'm not the police when I'm with them. I talk to them about things that are not police work, and if they're going to ask me questions about the job, I'll give them the sanitized version. But if I need to talk something out, I'm going to do that with other cops, just because I'm not going to horrify other people and drive them away, right? I've been really, really fortunate in my life too, is that my wife and I are best friends. Been married for 25 or more years now, and she's just a great listener, and so that's really helpful that I have that at home to kind of keep me balanced in that. And so again, it goes back to the resiliency piece, is that as a rubber band, I can come home, I'll twist that out of shape, and then she'll just be patient and allow me to vent whatever I'm venting about, which at this stage of my career is mostly about administrative frustrations, right? And then it's kind of out there and done, and we kind of go do our own thing. So
yeah. Any other questions?
I think we're good.
I'm good.
Yeah, asked everything I need.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you.
happy to do it.
Meet with us, and you've got some really good insights and good stuff. It's very interesting to hear, from your side of things as a chief to, Reiner from being an investigator to now working for the school, and then, Jamal being an SRO, just having those kind of three very different, very different outputs, all sort of and a lot of y'all said sort of the same things, but in a very different perspective. So it was very interesting. So we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Appreciate
for
you
your
guys
time.
including me in the project.